Shalom and welcome back. We are in Bashiri, chapter 47, that is Genesis 47, beginning this week where we left off last week, where Yusuf had sent his brothers back to the land of the Canaanite to get his father, Yaakov or Israel, and to bring him back down to the land of Mitzrayim. At the end of the last chapter, we talked about the joy of a parent laying eyes on their child, and the comparison of the spiritual blessing of when you see that child come to Yehovah for sanctification. It says, Then Yusuf came and reported to Pharaoh, saying, My Abba and my brothers with their flocks and herds and all that is theirs have come from the land of the Canaanite and are now in the region of Goshen. And selecting a few of his brothers, he presented them to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to his brothers, What is your occupation? They answered Pharaoh, We, your servants, are shepherds, as were our Abim, as were our Abbas. We have come, they told Pharaoh, to sojourn in this land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, the famine being severe in the land of the Canaanite. Now, I want to back up for a second. Look at this. Last week, I touched on the fact that Yusuf used his intimate knowledge of Pharaoh's personality, Pharaoh's leadership style, what have you, and told his brothers what they would need to say if they were going to be allowed to continue serving or working as shepherds. And so now we see that play out when they begin to play out when Pharaoh asks them exactly what Yusuf said that he would ask. Okay, so that tells me that, and I think we can look at it and say, okay, if you know the person's personality, you know their leadership style, you know what they're going to look for, you can use that. And a lot of people would say that's manipulation. I don't know that that's really manipulation so much as Yusuf is saying, I want the blessing, the approval of this leader. It could have been, your work at supervisor. It could have been, whatever. Children do this with parents all the time. I have one child. The other children say, well, how is it you always get what you want from dad? And she says, well, I always do my chores and my schoolwork. Okay, he doesn't have to stay after me to do these things, and the other kids don't always get that. But the one daughter tends to get what she asks for a lot more than the others, not because I favor her, but because she comes to me knowing what will get that favor. Okay, knowing that if her chores are done and her schoolwork is done and she's been behaving all day, that she's more likely to get what she wants. Well, I feel like Yusuf's kind of doing the same thing there with Pharaoh. Not that he's trying to manipulate Pharaoh just to get what he wants, but he knows what will keep him in good graces with Pharaoh. Okay, and that can even be a kind of an analogy to how we deal with Yehovah. Okay, we want his favor, we want his blessing, and a lot of the churches, the mainliners, they'll say, well, you can't manipulate God. No, you can't make God do anything, but he tells us in Torah, if you do these things, I will bless you. If you do these things, I will curse you. So if we want his favor, we should be doing the things that he says will lead to blessings. It says, pray then, let your servants stay in the region of Goshen. Then Pharaoh said to Yusuf, as regards your Abba and your brothers who have come to you, the land of Mitzrayim is open before you. Settle your father, your Abba, and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them stay in the region of Goshen, and if you know any capable men among them, put them in charge of my livestock. Now, here's the thing. Yusuf, if this had been anybody else's family, if Yusuf had said, hey, there's just this family of sheep herders who have come into the land, they need a place to stay, they want to stay in Goshen, and Pharaoh might have probably, because Yusuf knew how to be in good graces with Pharaoh, how to give him the information he wanted, and not a ton of other information, and gave him the right specific information to work things out as he did, Pharaoh probably still would have put them in Goshen. But if it hadn't been Yusef's family, would he have said, if you know capable men among them, put them in charge of my own livestock? I doubt it. Because he was looking at Yusef and all the years that Yusef had served him and all the blessings that had come upon him. And he said, you know what, there's something about this man, there's something about his Elohim, this Yehovah. I'm pretty sure he learned that from his Abba. And if his Abba, his father, has other sons, and Yusef says, you know what, they're good with herds and livestock, then my guess is going to be that they'll be blessed in the keeping of my flocks, like Yusef has been blessed in the keeping of everything else. Okay, and so people, today we call that dirty politics. It's nepotism. Nepotism may be illegal, but it's not always a bad thing, because we do seem to tend to see this tendency. Okay, there's a young lady that works with me now. I was 99% sure that she would work out and be a great worker as soon as I knew who her father was, because I've known her father for years, and I know his work ethic, and I know his reputation for being a hard worker and an honest man. And so when she came in was the trainee, and I put together who she was, I said, "Oh, this is your name, and you're from that town, so you must be this person's daughter." And she said, "Yes. How do you know my dad?" And we began the conversation. Immediately, I was very, very confident that no matter what task I gave her, it would be done well. Um, that's, you could almost be called a form of nepotism. I didn't give the job, but I went back to my supervisor later and said, I think this was a good hire on your part, and here's why. And she says, that's great to know. That could almost be a form of nepotism, because I respect this man, and therefore I gave like early praise to the decision to hire his daughter. But what we have found out is that that was right. Okay, she's completed her training faster than anybody else I've ever trained, and she's doing a phenomenal job. And no matter what task we give her, she seems to do very well at it. Nepotism, maybe politics, certainly. But there's something to be said for the way that a work ethic and a philosophy is passed down in a family. Yusef then brought his father Yaakov, his Abba Yaakov, and presented him to Pharaoh. And Yaakov greeted Pharaoh. Pharaoh asked Yaakov, "How many are the years of your life?" And Yaakov answered Pharaoh, "The years of my sojourn are 130. Few and hard have been the years of my life, nor do they come up to the lifespans of my Abba during their sojourns." Then Yaakov bade Pharaoh farewell and left Pharaoh's presence. Now let's take a thought about that. 130 years are the years of my life. Few and hard have been the years of my life. Does that make a lot of sense? Okay. Um, I really don't think that's what it's saying here. I'm not knocking the JPS translators. Okay. I think they do a phenomenal job, and by all means, I do not try to put myself in the place of a scholar of Hebrew. I know basic Hebrew, but sometimes I think this goes back to that whole showed-in thing I've talked about in earlier segments. And that's a Japanese term, not a Hebrew term, so don't get thrown off there. Showed-in literally means in Japanese the beginner mind. Okay, and it's the idea that sometimes when we need to have the eyes of a newbie, basically of a beginner, and we need to look at things in a simpler mindset, because we have a tendency to make things more complicated than they are. And I wonder if the Hebrew here, if as I look at it, I don't see few and hard are the years of my life. I see few have been the hard years of my life. In other words, I've been very blessed. Okay. And to me, that makes a lot more sense, not only coming from Yitzrael and his praise of Yehovah, but also I think coming from what we read about his life, he had been thoroughly blessed. Few had been the hard years of his life. Okay. And so when I read that, I take it that way and I think, you know what, this makes more sense than what I normally read in the English translation. And then it says, after he did that, he left Pharaoh's presence. And I think that's a model for us as believers. We were asked about ourselves. Instead, we should give praise to Elohim, to Yehovah, and then we should be done with it. It shouldn't be about us. It's a hard model to follow because our flesh wants to be about us. But if our minds are truly on spiritual things, our our hearts and our desires will be to give glory to Him and then to leave. So Yusuf settled his Abba and his brothers, giving them holdings in the choicest part of the land of Mizraim, in the region of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Yusuf sustained his father and his brothers and all his father's household with bread, down to the little ones. Okay, so he not only gave them land, he himself from his own provisions sustained 70 people. Okay, how blessed had he been in the worldly things? And yet his greatest joy, I know, was the blessing of seeing his father and his brothers come into the land of Goshen and have all that they needed instead of dying in the famine. Now, there was no bread in all the world. I'm going to stop right there in the middle of that sentence. I want you to back up. The previous sentence, Yusuf sustained everybody, the whole 70 of them from his own portion. Now, there's a break in the JPS text, and that break, it comes because there's a break in the Torah portion. And if you look at the majority text scrolls, you'll see that there is a break. And if you have a JPS that's interlineal, you can see that same break there. But it's not in most English Bibles. They don't do that. They just run them together. Okay, in one line, he's feeding everybody out of his own portion. In the next line, there's no food and no bread in all the world. Okay, it's important that we have that break in the text because it tells us a period of time has passed. And if you're reading a King James or most other English translations of this day, you will not see that break, and something gets lost there. And people say, "Well, that's a conundrum. That's was he hoarding all the food? Yeah, he was making sure his people were taken care of." But then it transpires that there's a difference there in time here. It says, "For the famine was very severe, both in the land of Mizraim and the land of the Canaani, and they languished because of the famine. Yusuf gathered in all the money that was to be found in the land of Mizraim and in the land of the Canaani, as payment for the rations that were being procured, and Yusuf brought the money into Pharaoh's palace." Okay. Yusuf, because of his wisdom in how he was managing Mizraim, now has great influence over the land of the Canaani. I've never heard it taught that was a means by which Yehovah was putting into play that we would later be the rulers of that land, the Canaani. But I think there's a foreshadowing there because he was not only taking care of the land he was governor of, he was taking care of the land that our people would later be kings of, and that had been promised to us. Also, it's important to note that there's a lot of debate between biblical scholars and historical scholars about the time period, the exact time when all of this was happening, when Yusuf would have been governor. But it's interesting to note that although there were many famines throughout the history of Mitzrayim, there was only one time when the Pharaoh was able to use the famine to centralize his government and to centralize the money system, okay, and to become more powerful thereby. Okay, I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm saying there's only one time in the history of Mitzrayim, in the history of Egyptology, that the Egyptologists have found that this happened. Okay, And so if you look that up, and I'm trying to think exactly the years there, but if you look that up in Egyptian history, I believe you can pinpoint exactly the time period when Yusuf was governor of the land. It says, and when the money gave out in the land of Mitzrayim and in the land of the Canaani, all the Mitzrayim came to Yusuf and said, give us bread, lest we die before your very eyes, for the money is gone. And Yusuf said, bring your livestock, and I will sell to you against your livestock if the money is gone. So they brought their livestock to Yusuf, and Yusuf gave them bread in exchange for the horses, for the stocks of sheep and cattle, and the asses. Thus he provided them with bread that year in exchange for all their livestock. So you see what's happening here. A lot of people look and say, oh wow, see, he's even centralizing even more the power, because now Pharaoh has all the money, all the grain, all the livestock. Everyone is dependent upon him. But I think something else that we miss here, again, something I've never heard taught, but I think it's very interesting that he takes, instead of money, he takes livestock. And if you look in later, when we're given the commandments about how to tithe, okay, we are told that we're supposed to bring from the livestock, and we're supposed to bring from the harvest of grains and fruits and what have you. Okay, I personally believe that part of the reason that commandment is given, that's how the tithes are given, that it's not money. Although you can use the money if you don't have livestock, you can use the money to buy livestock for the tithe and the offering. I believe that part of the reason it goes back to that, maybe not all, but at least part, is a remembrance that it was with the livestock that the grain was purchased, okay, for bread. That was part of how they stayed alive in Mitzrayim. It says, and when that year was ended, they came to him the next year and said to him, we cannot hide from my lord that all the money and animal stocks consigned to my lord, nothing is left at my lord's disposal save our persons and our farmland. Let us not perish before your eyes, both we and our land. Take us and our land in exchange for bread, and we with our land will be serfs to Pharaoh. Provide the seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not become a waste. Okay, so Yusuf gained possession of all the farmland in Mitzrayim for Pharaoh, every Mitzrayim having sold his field because the famine was too much for them. Thus the land passed over to Pharaoh, and he removed the population town by town from one end of Mitzrayim's border to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not take over, for the priests had an allotment from Pharaoh, and they lived off the allotment which Pharaoh had made to them. Therefore, they did not sell their land. So now Pharaoh has all of the grain, all of the money, all of the livestock, and all of the land. And his power is pretty much absolute. Okay. This is a model that has since been used by one government after another to control the people. Centralization of everything. Okay. This is why so many of our political leaders have their hands in things like food companies, okay, and food distribution centers, like your major food outlets and manufacturing outlets. So many of them, if you follow them, they're owned by a shell company that's owned by another shell company that's run by a board of directors that just happens to have as its CEO or president or whatever their title they use in that particular company, happens to be some bigwig in Indianapolis or New York City or Chicago, you know, some powerful person politically, and then it all centralizes back to Washington. And you see this in many nations around the world, not just ours, but this is the model that's being used. They'll control the food, by which they'll control the money, by which they'll control the people and their possessions. Then Yusuf said to the people, whereas I have this day acquired you and your land for Pharaoh, here is seed for you to sow the land. And when harvest comes, you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be yours, as seed for the fields, and as food for you and those in your households, and as nourishment for your children. And they said, you have saved our lives. You ever hear that? I hear it all the time from people on welfare and disability, and I'm not talking about people who are truly disabled. I mean, that if you're truly disabled, that's why you paid your taxes in before you were disabled, was to have that safeguard. Okay, I'm talking about people who are on disability. Why? Because they eat too much. Okay, or disability because they're lazy. Okay, and there's a lot of that. The system is very much misused. But you know what? I think our government wants it that way because then they control the people. If you become dependent upon the government for your paycheck or anything else, it's just one more finger of control that they have on you. And I've heard so many people say, "Well, if it weren't for me getting my food stamps, they saved my life." And the person's perfectly capable of working; they're just choosing not to. Okay. Again, I'm not putting down anybody for being poor. Okay, I've been poor. Okay, there were times I seriously thought about applying for benefits like that. But at the end of the day, I was able-bodied and I was able to go out and get a job. And maybe it wasn't the job I wanted. Maybe it was washing dishes in the back of a Denny's. I did that. Maybe it was shoveling manure out of a cattle stall for less than minimum wage. I've done that too. Maybe I stopped driving my car and walked from one job to the next job or hitchhiked because I couldn't afford the gas and food for my family. But I found a way. I stopped driving. Why? Why did I not go out and put myself into one of those programs? I didn't put myself in one of those programs because I didn't want to be controlled by the government. Okay. And again, I'm not condemning anybody out there who takes some sort of help when they're seriously in need. But for those who have fallen into the trap of taking what they don't really need, taking quote unquote help when they're really capable of doing it on their own, I'm here to tell you, you've just sold yourself out to Pharaoh. So stop saying that the Pharaoh of our time is saving your life. It says, we are grateful to my Lord, and we shall be serfs to Pharaoh. And Yusuf made it into a land law in Mitzrayim, which is still valid, that 1/5 should be Pharaoh's, only the land of the priests did not become Pharaoh's. When it says it's still valid, this is Moshe writing the history of the people during the Exodus, during the time that we were traveling in the desert, in the wilderness. And he's telling the people reading it then that it's still a law in his time, 430 years after it happened. Okay? And if you think about it, we wanted to be out from under the slaves, or out from being slaves, out from under our slave masters. What people miss, if you don't read this in context, read the history in context, is that the people we were slaves to were slaves to Pharaoh. Okay, so we were slaves to the slaves. That's why it was so bad. Not that being a slave would be good, but the reason it was so terribly bad for us is that we were owned by people who were slaves to Pharaoh. Thus Yisrael settled in the country of Mitzrayim, in the region of Goshen. They acquired holdings in it and were fertile and increased greatly. So why were we able to gather holdings? Why does it come back to that? Because time has passed, and we've gone through the whole process of becoming slaves, or all the people of Mitzrayim are becoming slaves. It's because at this point we weren't slaves yet. We were protected by Yusuf. we were able to acquire lands. Okay, we were able to do these things because we were the household of Yusuf in the eyes of Pharaoh. And therefore, even though, yeah, he would have taken possession of the lands, we were out there caring for Pharaoh's flocks. We were out there serving Pharaoh. We weren't yet at that destitute level of being the slaves to the slaves. That's going to come later. Their fertility increased greatly. Yaakov lived 17 years in the land of Mitzrayim. So that is the span of Yaakov's life. So that the span of Yaakov's life came to 147 years. And when the time approached for Yisrael to die, he summoned his son Yusuf and said to him, "Do me this favor. Place your hand under my thigh as a pledge of your steadfast loyalty. Please do not bury me in Mitzrayim. When I lie down with my fathers, take me up from Mitzrayim and bury me in their burial place." He replied, "I will do as you have spoken." And he said, "Swear to me." And he swore to him. Then Yisrael bowed at the head of the bed.